Okay, so today, you guys, I'm going to be demonstrating glazing. Everybody got a handout, right? Okay. All right, so with glazing, I was asking these guys if they ever saw Forrest Gump when they came in. Have you guys ever seen Forrest Gump?
Yeah.
All right, glazing is a little bit like Forrest Gump because it's like a box of chocolates. You're never sure what you're going to get. There's some, and I will show you at the end, there are some ways you can create, because you guys are doing some detail work, and I'm going to show you how you can paint specific things, specific colors. But most of all, glazing in this temperature is a little bit more like dyeing Easter eggs than it is like painting a picture. Okay? So most of it is dipping the glaze into a big, or the piece into a big bucket of glaze rather than using a brush. So I'll get to some of these details a little bit later, but for right now we're going to show you the basics. First thing, got a couple definitions you guys need to know. Vitreous and porous are the first things we're going to talk about. So when your pot comes back from the first firing and it is bisqueware, it is still porous, which means it still absorbs water. Okay, porous means it still absorbs water. That's a good thing because that's how it absorbs your glaze. When you dunk it in the bucket, it's going to actually, suck up like a little bit of water, and in that water, suspended in that water, is the powder, which is the colorant and all that kind of stuff, and then it sticks to the walls. So, that being said, you need it to remain porous before you glaze it, which means as you're wiping it off, this is the first thing you're going to do, to remove it from dust and stuff, you do not want to soak the walls full of water. So you don't want to take this, stick it under the faucet, and then wash it like a dish, because even though this is hard, it's just like a sponge. It's soaking things up. Now you can kind of see that when I wipe it, because as I wipe it, that water disappears pretty quickly into the wall there. All right, so vitreous, what does that mean? Any guesses? What's that? Right, it will no longer, it's watertight. So when you put the glaze on the surface, you're putting a vitreous coating over the top of it. Now the clay body itself just comes closer to being vitreous, but it's not completely vitreous. It's the glaze that coats the surface that makes this vitreous, and therefore food safe. Or water safe. So if you're going to take your coil pot and you're going to use it to put flowers in, the glaze is the thing that makes the water stay inside of there and not seep out. If I were to fill this pot without any glaze on it with water and leave it on the counter, it would stay for a minute, but you'd come back the next morning and it would have gone through the walls and be all over the table. Okay? So you need that coating not only to make it pretty, but to make it watertight. Alright, so the first thing I'm doing, as I said, is I'm wiping all the dust and oil off with a sponge. If you have a coil pot that has a really small opening and you can't get your hand down in there, two things you can do. Number one, you can kind of forget about it and let it maybe crawl a little bit on the bottom, and I'll explain what crawling is in a little bit. The other thing you can do is if you're really, really fast and you get the water on the faucet going, you can stick it under the faucet, rinse it real quick, and dump it out real quick. But you got to move quick if you're doing that because you don't want it to get saturated, right? Okay, so you want to wipe the inside and outside of it as best as you can because you're trying to remove the oil from your fingers and dust from the firing, or just from sitting on the shelf in here. As you can see, this gets to be a pretty dusty environment. And if it has any of those things on there, the glaze may not stick. Okay, so I'm giving it a good wipe down. Then I have to choose my glaze. All right, so there's a couple definitions you need to know about there. Transparent, translucent, and opaque. So, who knows what transparent means?
See-through.
You can see through it completely. So light passes through it completely, which means it would be clear. A clear glaze. What about translucent? You can kind of see through it, exactly. It means that light partially passes through. So in this case, it means it's like a stained glass window, where you're going to see through it, but it might have some color to it. What about opaque?
No light.
No light passes through it, right? So it will cover things up. So why do you think that that matters for glaze choice?
Do you just want to put a clear glaze on it, one like this, or like that?
Well, if you want to put a clear glaze on it, you're just going to see, you won't get any color at all. It'll just see through to the color of the clay. So you're probably not going to use clear most of the time. You're probably going to want some kind of a color. But for what reason would I want to see through to my piece?
Top coat.
Let's look at something like this. These have some translucent glazes on there. Do you see the incising detail through, even though they've put a color on? That's why you want to choose translucent. So if you're choosing a color, it's more than just a color. If you have spent the time to make some intricate details on there, you're going to want to choose something where you can not cover those things up and you can see through it. Now, one of the things I always push with you guys is to not incise with a pin tool. So if you do as I say and you incise with either a wood tool or a sharp pencil, usually you can go ahead with an opaque glaze and you'll still see the pattern. But if you do really, really delicate work with your pin tool or something very, very thin, you're probably going to want to stick to translucent so you can actually see all that work you did, right? So it's more than just choosing color. So again, why would you choose a translucent glaze? So you can see the detail. So why would I choose opaque then? Why would I want to cover anything up?
Like a crack or anything?
Okay, so let's say when we were doing our greenware check-in and you looked at it and it had canvas marks or rough spots that you wish you would have smoothed out a little bit better. If you put an opaque glaze on there, you can kind of, smooth some things out. It gives it a little bit of an additional smoothing. Now, this is an opaque glaze, this white one, so you can kind of see how it started covering up her incising because she used a pin tool. But then the surface of it is really, really smooth. Right? So there's pros and cons to both. Something to think about as you're choosing your color. Okay, so to get these pots glazed, I just picked a couple of colors over here that I am going to mix up and show you how they work. I'm going to choose glaze number 5 to start, and let me show you what all these kind of colors look like. On the wall over here, I have a chip chart. It's brand new. I have not completed it in total yet, so I'll explain the way it works. I need to put some labels up there. The chip chart is designed to show you the combinations of colors. So everything in this row has what's in bucket number 1 first, and then the second coat is a different bucket, right? So this is bucket number 1 with bucket number 1. So this is what bucket number 1, if you did it all by itself, looks like. This is bucket number 1 first, and then bucket number 2 second. Bucket number 1 first, bucket number 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 1 and 7, and so on and so forth. So it's always bucket number 1 as the first color, and then different ones as your second coat. This column will be the opposite, so it's always going to be bucket number 1 second. So this is 1 first with 1 second. This is 2 first with 1 second. 3 first with 1 second. So you can see how it changes depending on which coat you put first. Now, I have labeled on the bottom of them which buckets they are. So when you pick, if you look at this and you go, oh, I really like this color, you can look at the bottom and it has a number on it. It says 3/5. So you know if you want to get this color, you're going to first do bucket number 3, and then you're going to do bucket number 5 to get this result. Okay? The only thing I ask is that you do not walk away with the chip, because I see people pick it up and go, oh, this looks really nice, and then they get lost. So I want you to look at them, feel free to take them off, look at them, and then when you're done and you know what you're going to do, put it back. Don't leave this area with the chip in your hand. The other thing that these chips have is on the top of the loop here, there's some incise marks. So it can show you the level of opacity or translucency. And you can see how much your marks might get covered up with that color choice. Okay? So look for those along the way too. Here's one that's a little bit more opaque, and this one here is a little more translucent so you can see them a little bit better. Okay? Alright, so the basics are this. Bucket number 1, sorry, I'm going to sneak that through. Bucket number 1 is called Plantation Moss. By itself, it kind of looks like this. It's a translucent greenish, brownish glaze with some speckles. Bucket number 2 is white by itself. So 2 and 2 is just like this. Bucket number 3 is forest green, very popular color and a smart little glaze. It performs very well. So it's just your basic green color. Bucket number, that was 1, 2, 3, 4 is this one, which is the royal blue color. So it's a dark blue. Bucket number 5 is also blue. It's just a little bit lighter. It varies a little bit. Sometimes it's this light, sometimes it's like this, somewhere in between. But it is more opaque than the bucket number 4. Bucket number 6 is purple. I call this Barney purple. It looks like Barney the dinosaur to me. This color by itself, I do think looks like a big purple dinosaur. I got rid of it at one point because I thought it was a little bit flat and the students all freaked out and wanted it back. But I will say the purple looks really, really nice when you mix it with something else. So by itself it can look a little bit flat, but if you use a different color with it in combination, it's a pretty nice glaze. Bucket number 7 is brown. So by itself it looks like this.
What is that?
It's a spider. Bucket number 8, see, she had a Halloween theme. Bucket number 8 is, okay, so bucket number 8 is the peach, and bucket number 9 is this yellow. Alright, so the glazes that I picked to work with today is I'm going to just pick bucket number 1, which is my Plantation Moss, just to show you what the glazes look like raw compared to fired. Now this is what I think makes glazing the hardest thing ever, is that students have a tendency to have a hard time, and anybody has a hard time understanding that the glaze is going to look really, really different when it's raw versus when it's fired. So as I mix this, and I will show you your choice of mixing utensils, you don't have to use your hand. As you mix this, you can see that this is kind of like a brownish color. So this is what it looks like raw, and then after it's fired, it turns this color. So your pot will not look like what you want it to look like until it comes back from the kiln. You have to have a little bit of trust with this, that that's going to end up working out right. Now, I mix with my hand because I can feel when I mix down at the bottom if there's a bunch of goop. The thing I should tell you though is that the things that are in the glaze that make the color are oftentimes metals, like cobalt, if you check your periodic table of elements, is a metal. And metals can actually absorb through the skin into the bloodstream. So I do it quickly, and then I wash my hands, and I use the nail brush, and I make sure I don't leave the glaze sitting on my hands. Okay? So let me wash my hands real quick. So if you have open cuts and things like that, also not advisable. To be safe, you can always use what I have, stir sticks, and I have ladles. And the ladles are hanging on the back of the sink, and the stir sticks are usually underneath the sink. So if you want to use something like this, you certainly can. The only thing is that those metals, because they're metal, they're heavy. So after the glaze sits for a long time, they sink to the bottom, and you get this sludge on the bottom, and it's watery up on the top. So as I'm mixing, I don't want to just go round and round and round like this. I also kind of want to lift up and get those heavy things out of there. Hi, Alex. Okay. Jake, it's for you, but you don't have to go now.
Cool.
Oh no, you do have to go now, immediately. If you can pass the camera.
Sure, fine.
So I kind of want to lift up as I'm mixing and not just go round and round in a circle. Alright. Now, the other thing is I want to give you a visual on this. Over here I have bucket number 5, which is blue, and bucket number 2, which is white. I want to show you what these glazes look like when they're raw. This one isn't very well mixed. This is number 2. This is number 5. They look almost the same, right? But totally different once they're fired. The reason that is because the raw material of cobalt carbonate is like a really light pinky purple color, and you don't see it when it's raw, but it fires to a deep rich blue. That being said, here's what some students have done. Alright, I'm stirring my blue glaze, da-de-da-de-da. I'm going to use white also, but you know, it looks exactly the same, so I don't think I'm going to clean my stir stick. I'm just going to start stirring it over here. And then what you do is you contaminate your glazes. So it's kind of the honor system. I'm not going to police you, but let me tell you what happens if you do this. Number 1, we don't know if you have contaminated glazing the glazes until we do a firing, and everybody who wanted white pots have this like grayish color to their pots, and then they're a little bit disappointed, right? So you don't want to do that because we won't know until it's too late. Number 2, if you do that and contaminate the glaze, well, guess what, guys? We got a new glaze color, because clay is not expensive, but glazes are very expensive. Cobalt carbonate, the material I told you about, is such an expensive material that they price it daily like it's gasoline or gold. Okay? So if we contaminate a glaze, we continue to use that glaze. We use it up. So don't contaminate the glazes. You guys can remind your friends when you're up here, but I'm not going to stand here and police you. So just remember to not contaminate your glazes. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to show you some good ways to glaze, and I'm going to kind of flip around a little bit here and go to the back side of your worksheet. And I'm going to talk about the best ways to glaze a pot. And Maribel, you can copy my notes later if you want.
Okay.
The very, very best way, if you can do it, is to dip the entire piece in the glaze. So if your coil pot fits in the bucket, you can dump the whole thing. This one's a little bit large, a little bit cumbersome, so I don't think I can actually handle that maneuver in the bucket. So I'm not going to dip it. The second best option is to pour the glaze. Alright, so I can use any container as long as I've washed it out, and I know this one looks dirty, but it's just paint on there and it's stuck. It's not going to contaminate the glaze. I am going to take some of this glaze, pour it on the inside, and then I'll do the outside next. Now, I want you to see how quickly I do this. Remember that the pot itself is porous. So as I'm doing this, the entire time it's going to be sucking glaze up. So I'm going to wait. I want you guys to watch how quickly I do this. Are you ready? Okay, so I'm going to pour it in there. 2 scoops if I need it. I am not going to dilly-dally. I am going to quickly pour it and out. And as I pour it out, I'm going to turn it because I'm going to try to coat. So I didn't act like my hair wasn't on fire, kind of like fast. But I'm not going to stand here and hold it. I'm not going to stand here and hold it full of glaze and talk to my friend because the whole time it's soaking up glaze while I'm doing that. If it soaks up too much glaze, it gets thick, and then it can have a glaze defect called crawling. Okay? So you see up the top there it says there's some glaze defects. Crawling is the number one, and it's really the only one I'm going to have you write down today actually because it's the most important one because this is the one you're going to see the most. Crawling essentially means that your glaze pulls away from the surface and reveals bald spots. The 2 main reasons glazes crawl are either because, number 1, you forgot to wipe your pot off before you glazed it, and there was some dust that didn't allow the glaze to adhere to the wall of the pot, or number 2, because you got your glaze on too thick. So you don't want to dilly-dally in the bucket or your glaze can crawl. A little bit of crawling isn't a big deal, and it still will be watertight, but generally students don't like that result, so don't dilly-dally. Alright, so the second best way, I'll show you how I'm going to do the outside, and I always do the inside first because then I can still hold it by the outside. I'm going to dip it for that outside coat. Now, if you want to dip it in 2 different buckets, like if you want the inside one color and the outside a different color, that's fine, you can do that. it won't contaminate glazes. Now that this is dry, I could dip it in another color and it won't contaminate because this is dry. Okay? And I go fast. I don't dilly-dally. Okay? So when I put this in, and I'm just for the sake of it being easy, I'm just going to go ahead and use the same glaze, and I'm going to just dip it straight down. I'm going to try to take it right to the lip, and then I'm going to pull it out. Now this is the most fun part of glazing, because what you have to do is you have to hold it until it dries. If I go to handle the pot when it's wet, I'm going to mess up the glaze. So I want to just, and you can hold it by the bottom if it's really heavy. You can hold it by the bottom, but you need to, before you set it down, let it dry. The good news is it dries within a minute, usually. You know that it's dry when it's not shiny anymore. So did you see when I took it out of the bucket, it was really shiny, and now it's getting a more matte texture? So it's drying. And once it's that matte texture, you can touch it with a dry finger and it won't mar the surface. All right? So the bottom is still a little bit wet. So what you can do at this stage of the game, if you want to, is you can wipe the dry foot. And what that means is you're going to wipe the glaze off the bottom. So, and I like to do it now because it's easier to wipe it off when it's wet. You do not have to wipe the dry foot until you're done with the entire glazing process. This is not something that needs to be done in between each coat. But the key to wiping it easily is notice how often I'm rinsing my sponge out. If I don't rinse my sponge out frequently, then I just smear the glaze around, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to rinse all that glaze out pretty frequently. Also, you want to be neat with how you're wiping it. If you're sloppy with how you wipe that edge, it'll look sloppy when it comes out of the kiln. Some people put wax resist on the bottom. So you know, like when you're dyeing Easter eggs and you can you can color on it with a crayon and then you dip it in and then it won't stick to that spot where the crayon was. It's the same concept. It's wax. The crayon is waxy and it makes the surface resist the glaze. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about wax resist in a second, other things you can do with it. So I want to make sure all the glaze is off of there. Okay, now the third best way to glaze is dabbing. D-A-B, dabbing. Why would I want to dab? Well, there's a couple things you want to do with dabbing and a couple things you don't. You see how I got this edge right here and I didn't get any glaze on it? The best way for me to get some coverage on there is to just dab with my finger. And I'll make sure my hands are dry when I'm holding the piece, touching the piece, otherwise I'll mess up the surface. But I can just take my finger and I can dab those spots. You can see that little green thing that came out when I did that. See how it turned kind of green? That's the metal in there. That's the copper carbonate that you're seeing. And that's why it turns this color when it melts. So I can just take my finger and dab it. Now some people get really upset because this can make it look rough and bumpy. When this thing gets fired, it is going to melt and it will smooth itself out. So remember at the beginning I said the people who care the least usually get the best results. So if you're like a perfectionist and you're like, oh, that bumpiness really bothers me, and I see students trying to rub it and smooth it out, don't do that. Let it be bumpy. Because if it's bumpy and it'll melt, you'll get good coverage and it'll still be smooth. If you have a drip, you might see the drip as a color change, but it won't be thick. It'll melt and be smooth. If you're rubbing your glazes, and this particular glaze here is a little chalkier than this one, but you can see when the glaze is dry, so here's like an example of a drip. That will melt and be smooth, but you might see a color. What I see students do is start rubbing it like a pot and they're expecting a genie to come out of it because they want to smooth it all out. You can rub it a little bit. So if I get these little pinholes in there, I can rub it just to make that pinhole get filled in with the dust, but I don't want to rub it a lot. 2 reasons. Number 1, that dust has free silica in it, and the free silica is the stuff you breathe in and you get silicosis. So it's harmful to your lungs if you're rubbing it and there's a dust cloud around you. Number 2 is that you're actually rubbing the glaze off, and even though you think you're smoothing it, you're taking the glaze off and you'll have like a bald pot. So fill in pinholes gently, but don't go crazy with the rubbing, okay? So another reason that you would want to dab is this, and I'll get a little bit more into this in a little bit, but let's say you want to have a blue pot, but then you want some, you know, butterflies to be green or leaves to be green or something. So you would dip it in the first color and then dab the second color where you wanted that to go, all right? So that would be another reason. So if I wanted to take this and maybe I wanted these balls in the coil pot there to be blue, I could dab each one with the blue. So let me show you that too. Now, the worst way to glaze a pot is to brush it. So when I dab using a paintbrush, I never do this pulling motion. If I do this, I can actually re-soften the glaze and end up pulling off the first layer, and I end up seeing brush strokes. So you don't want to do that. If I want to use a brush instead of my fingers, I'm going to use a motion like this to do any dabbing in the areas that I'd want it to be a different color. So those are the two reasons that you would dab. You never dab an entire pot. It'll take you like 30 years to glaze that pot if you do that. It's always a second coat, okay? Okay, so next. So we did dipping, dabbing, pouring, and brushing as the best and worst ways to glaze a pot. If you brush it, it basically pulls the glaze off. We covered crawling. We talked a little bit about contamination, which is you'll only know when your pot comes out the wrong color. And I touched on wiping the dry foot, but I'm not quite done with that. Yeah?
If you have a crack in your pot and you put glaze in it, and when you fire the glaze, can it like spread apart the crack even more?
It can. It can do, and you never know. Anthony's question was if you have like a little crack in your pot and you put the glaze on it, can the glaze make it separate even more? And the answer is, as the clay gets fired, it continues to shrink, all the way from the time that it's drying to the bisque firing to the glaze firing. So things can pull and separate more in a firing. They can also fill cracks, but you never really know how the firing is going to behave until you do it. So it's not a guarantee that it can fix a crack. It might make it worse, but it might actually fill it in too. Good question. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the dry foot. So I showed you guys that when you're done, you have to wipe all the glaze off the bottom. The reason for that is that when these pots get fired, they reach really high temperatures and the glaze has to heat up in order to become both glassy, because all those little dust particles suspended in the liquid are the things that are the colorants and the things that make it shiny and stuff like that. So as this melts, it looks like a little bit of molten lava, just a little layer of molten lava over the surface of the piece. And if you have molten lava on the bottom of this cup and then it dries, what do you think is going to happen?